So, hey, good afternoon. Welcome to Grandmother's Voice, Speak Up and Empower, where we just talk, real talk, about Indigenous people and not even issues. We're not issues. We're just realness. Anyway, today I'll thank Karen at Speak Up and Empower and Speak Up and Empower for creating this amazing space for us to sit and talk and share information and share each other's views and passions. And I'm really excited today to introduce my brother Gordo, who has been one of my major inspirations my whole life, and has always stood behind me like the rest of my family. Not watching right now because I see there's no one watching, but it doesn't matter because brother, I'm here with you and I'm so excited. I tell you, I call you all the time when things are happening, and you're always my first one to be like, hey, yeah, just do you, be you. And I'm just so honored that you support me 150%. And I brought you on because we always have these passionate conversations that last hours. And I always think that there's nobody else that really would endure my conversations like you do. And it's probably the truth. But anyway, I'm just really excited because our conversations have been really, really passionate always about who we are individually, but more so these days because of what's happening in the real world and, in our real world. And, and I just want everybody to hear your way of thinking and the way that you share your knowledge and your perception of things. And I just introduce yourself to everybody. Gordo.
Jody, I am your brother, Gord Kelpers. Thank you for inviting me on this show. This is awesome. And that was a hell of a compliment. It was really kind of warmed my heart. And I feel the same way about you too. You are quite the inspiration, especially the last few months. I've been following Grandmother's Voice pretty closely. I've been looking at it. Sorry, my phone's going off. I'm going to turn it off right now. How are we doing? And just watching the work that you've done with Grandmother's Voice over the last few months is pretty cool. Because I remember when you first started Grandmother's Voice there a couple of years ago, and I surfed it and I was looking, oh, okay, this is interesting, it's nice. But now I'm back on it and I'm taking a look, like there's a lot of people involved with it. So it was actually pretty cool. And then of course the other night we were talking about discussing your plan to move forward with Grandmother's Voice, and that was also inspirational. It's something I've always dreamed of is to move forward with the business that way as well. So very impressive. You're a very impressive person. So thanks.
Thanks, brother. Your connection's dismal. But that's okay. I see your gorgeous face and know that we're just here to, talk about all of these realities that I think that we would have never talked about 30 years ago while we were learning about our culture and our family and our place in society, which, I say that, but our parents, our mom and dad, and our stepfather Perry, and even while our dad was around, even though he was, I guess we could say, he was a bit lost in his identity, he still said to us, you need to be who you are, connect who you are. And so it's really important that we follow that language that they told us, just be who you are. And it was our journey to figure out who we are, and they always held us up to be able to be that person. And so we had a conversation last week, and I've always checked with you and said, like, what do we doing this, when I say doing this work, I think the work part of it was being me, right? And for over like the last 30 years, really stepping into who I am as an Indigenous woman, urban Indigenous woman, and figuring out that, hey, like I have a voice, and the more I learn, the more I want to share and make sure that other people that are in the same, similar situation that I am in, I find them and I do this work with them. And that's really how Grandmother's Voice has started to kind of grow, is, the trust thing, that was a theme this week for me, is trust. Everybody's questioning trust. How do you trust in a time like this, um, doing work that is so, it's tiring, right? And just, I guess, just circling back to just knowing that we had really strong family values, and even though we didn't know our history and didn't understand the pain that my father and his family went through, we've learned that, and we've used I guess the morals and the love that our family nurtured us with to do this work. So I just, this is who I am authentically. I've always just really been able to be who I am, and I think it's because of the people behind me always pushed me to do that work. But anyway, my brother Gord, who's on the other end of, well, beside me here, but on the other end of this computer with me, has always, he has a really strong voice himself, and has always really immersed himself into, I want to say politics, but not so much that are out there preaching to the world or want to be in that position, but you understand. And, I want to kind of, just kind of open it up and say, like, where are we right now as urban Indigenous people that have an opportunity to share our voices with even our neighbors? And when the conversation happens, because it does happen, and there's just so much unknowing, unpacking all of those things that people have said, like, how do we, as neighbors, families, people, move forward in a time like this? Like, what do you recommend? Because we are at the school board, we say to people, I think right now it's time for Indigenous people to step into it and just be in their culture and what they're learning, and everybody else should read books. I don't know, like, learn, I guess, So if I could just say, like, tell me about first your passion and what you do every day, what your passions are, because you're like an education guy. You've been in this going to school as long as I can remember to just learn things. So just kind of step in and tell the people watching who you are and where your passions lie, and why you're here today.
Well, what a fantastic question that was. Not the tail end of it. That's pretty cool. I'm just talking about how you set up that question. I've watched a couple of your interviews, and some of them are pretty good. And you asked some really good probing questions. So let's go to the first question that you asked. What is it that drives me every day when it comes to what's going on in the world, and especially with Indigenous people? And that's basically the topic of our conversation, is what's happening in the Indigenous world. But before we get into talking about Indigenous people and what's happening in the Indigenous world, especially here in Canada, I think I'd like to set some groundwork and add some nuance and some empathy to a discussion that really desperately needs a lot of nuance and a lot of empathy. And if you recall the conversation we had the other night, I gave you that little analogy about the fish. The guy's walking down a pier, and he looks in the water, he sees a fish, and he says, "How's the water?" And the fish says, "What water?" And what a wonderful analogy to what's happening in the world today. Uh, you know, we, including the white people, we all live in a society. We all live in a system that we don't realize how damaging and how toxic it is. So we're the fish analogy and the water analogy. The fish is the person, or the average person in society today, and the water is the system that we operate in, the economic, the political system, et cetera, et cetera. And we just don't see it. We just don't see how toxic and how dangerous it is. And one way to describe the system that we live in, both economic, political, and social economic, is some people refer to it as the establishment. Now, before you and your listeners grab your tinfoil hats and say, "Oh, Gord is going to be a conspiracy theorist," I'm not a conspiracy theorist at all. I think conspiracy theories are most of them are pretty absurd and ridiculous. However, I will say this: there is a conspiracy going on. It's been going on for at least 150, 200 years, and that's to maintain this establishment. And there's not one or two or even a small series of people or entities that motivate this establishment or this conspiracy. It's everybody. Everybody's involved in it. And the people that get pushed outside, you've heard of the term marginalized people. I'm sure we all have. When people become marginalized, they start to realize that the system. It's not their fellow human being. It's the system that they participate in that we've supported for over 150 years, especially here in Canada and in the Western world, which dominates and feeds off things like fear and racism and xenophobia, because it feeds that narrative. Because if we ever get to a point where, and here's a startling statistic that most Canadians aren't aware of, and this one made me want to throw up. I read this about 6 months ago. Of all the Western societies, all the first world societies throughout the world, Canada, forget the Indigenous people for just a brief second here. The country of Canada has the highest, by far, by an order of magnitude, the highest homeless rate in the world. Like, we are 1 in 70 in this country, and unfortunately, 40% are Indigenous. 1 in 70 Canadians. So count 70 Canadians around you. One of those people are going to be homeless. That's disgusting, as opposed to the United States, which is supposedly a more oppressive country. It's like 1 in 250 people are homeless, or in UK, or in much lower numbers. So it's a system that we've participated in. And then when we go to talk about how we solve these problems, like homelessness, like Indigenous race, like Black Lives Matter, for example, the reason why we don't have the political will to do it, to solve these problems, because we have the resources. So when anybody tells me that we don't have the resources to house every human being on this planet, forget about Canada, but on this planet, or feed every human being on this planet, or make sure every human being on this planet has access to decent internet, decent water, etc., it's because it doesn't feed the monster. And I'm going to give you another analogy. I want you to think of the system, or the establishment, as a huge organism, one-celled organism that has to feed on all this stuff in order to keep going. And this organism is toxic. It destroys the earth. And some people call it capitalism. Some people call it neoliberalism. And it's based on consumption. It's based on economic growth, which is completely unsustainable. It doesn't take a scientist to really, or an educated person to really figure out that the system that we're living in right now is bad for the environment and bad for humanity as a whole. And I'll go one step further and say that in order to continue this monster, these things like the marginalized have to be oppressed, because we have the solutions. They're right there. They've been there forever. We have the resources. And I'll give you one more solid example that happened about a month ago. That we have the resources. And in the midst of this pandemic, the Canadian and Ontario governments found hundreds of millions of dollars to support Ford Motor Company's conversion in the Oakville assembly plant to convert to electric vehicles. Well, we as Canadians, I think, have been asking the wrong questions of our government and of our corporate partners. And one of the questions that we didn't ask with respect to this example is, instead everybody was celebrating it. The government was celebrating Ford Motor Company, and even some people were like, "Oh, this is a great idea," because that's the system we live in. That's the system that we support. Well, we've got hundreds of millions of dollars to convert Ford to. Well, why do we live in a system where we have to bribe corporations to stay here in Canada and do the right thing? Why didn't Ford convert to an electric? Why didn't Ford Assembly, which has had, I've been in the Ford Assembly as a salesman before, and I can tell you they have the capacity to build. They've had the capacity for over 30 years to convert to electric. Why did it take hundreds of millions of dollars? Why aren't we asking those questions, right? So all I'm trying to say is why don't we look? Why aren't we asking those questions? Why do we're all victims, including white people, all victims of this system, of this society that supports this neoliberalism and capitalism, which must be fed. So we, the Canadian governments and the Ontario governments donated hundreds of millions of dollars. Why can't they? What is it? Why aren't we having the discussions about how we could use that money? Let's say housing the homeless and making sure everybody has a job, which is not a difficult thing to do.
Sorry, that's awesome. Your feed is dismal, but your words are so good and intense. I'm trying, like your mouth is moving and you're like it's a second afterwards. So just so you know how we're receiving it. So we're gonna have to fix that next time. Because I already feel like we're gonna be having this conversation or this experience more and more, because I just love the way that you speak, and you're so relaxed and sharing it so naturally. But I love all that. I love that way of thinking. I've never really been the one to to study like you do. I'm just like in the living, and I feel like maybe that's a part of my gift, is just being able to do and create and make things happen. And I think that is so important, that even in all of this, right, those are deep, hard things to do, because we're not talking about taking one person or a couple people and making change by telling them that it's like, wow, they're going to have 1,000 excuses why they can't do that, and they're going to make it, and they're going to manipulate it so that it looks like this is the only thing that we can do. And everything that you just said, those examples are just, there's so many that we could unpack and break down. But I think it's important, as the average person right now, because that's what I posted on here that we're going to talk about, is how can the average person who, like, for one, right now, Thomas, or my son, your nephew, is in university, and he's talking to or had said to me, hey mom, I have an essay due. Can you take a look at this? And, he basically said, can you write it for me? And I'm like, no, because this is obviously learning, but it's not just learning for education. It's learning for you and building you up to be the urban Indigenous man that you need to do and learn and understand. And so these issues are not just about right now in the surface. This is understanding the history of why the people that are, we'll say, like the Indigenous people right now that are dealing with the treaty issues and the land back and the fisheries and all of these other issues, and the conversations are not just about it's just not about like fixing it right now in this way. This is about fixing, like you said, 150, 200 years of just not doing the right thing. And if people would have done the right thing, these people wouldn't be saying, hey, wait, I'm awoken now, because now I can stand in my power and in my knowledge and know that these treaties are not being respected. And and so you, in all of these relations, we'll say, you have the people that are in it, that are passionate, that are affected by it, by being the people. And then you have, like I said, the neighbors. I have 50 neighbors in my neighborhood, and probably half of them know what I do for a living, because I'm very vocal about it. And I make sure that when I'm doing something, I tell them what I'm doing. I want to invite them in. So if we had this opportunity right now for you to say, because I know you and I get in these conversations and we can reel people in, and then at the end of it, they're like, what's my action? Tell me what my action is, right? Where in saying all of that stuff that you just shared with us, is you have an opportunity right now to say to people, this is how you find out this is what I want you to know. And I want you to trust what I'm saying right now, and do whatever you can to change your mindset, that this is the reality and what I have to do.
Another fantastic, well nuanced, well asked, contextualized question, and I'd be more than happy to answer it, Joey. Christopher Lynn Hedges is one of my favorite authors. He wrote a book about 10 years ago called America the Farewell Tour. I read it last Christmas, and I was just blown away by it. But one of the things he talks about is the decline of the American empire right now as it stands, and we're witnessing it right now. And we're seeing signs of it here in Canada as well, maybe not as deep and as powerful as what's happening in the States. And I advise everybody to read that book. It was just an eye-opener. And he was a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist with the New York Times that covered the Balkan War. He was immersed with the American troops in Serbia at the time, back in the 90s. But he wrote a lot of books, and one of the quotes out of that book which really struck me is that in today's day and age, and this is going back 10 years ago when we read it, but social media was still prevalent, is optimism in the United States has been reduced to nearly a disease. Now, I said nearly, you want to be careful. So what actions can you take? Can an individual take? There's nothing wrong with being optimistic. I don't want people to misinterpret what I'm saying. What I'm saying is optimism to the point where, and you can see it in your social media, you see it in Facebook, you can see it in Twitter, you can see it in Instagram, where optimism is almost masking what's happening out there today. Not just with Indigenous people, but with the Black Lives Matter movement, xenophobia. It's like, so to fully answer your question, Jody, I think that people have to, first of all, before they can take any action, they have to acknowledge what's happening out there. Really, truly acknowledge what's happening out there. And then, quoting Gandhi, be the change that you want in real life. And there's a lot of things you can do as an individual to get involved. Uh, you know, uh, join a political party, for example. Do volunteer work. I've been a volunteer. I've been doing volunteer work off and on for 30 years. It's something that takes the focus off your own issues and really makes people feel good in general. You can't change. One person cannot change the world, although some people have tried and have been pretty successful in some areas. But there are, you need to get involved. You need to find something that you're very passionate about and just start, because that's what helps me sleep at night. There's not much that I can do as an individual except get involved, do the best I can, treat people with respect, treat people with kindness, treat people with empathy when you can. Sometimes I can't. Sometimes I get sick of some certain views and I have to, speak up and get loud, just like you. I know you're like that as well. So there's lots of things that you can do, or you can sit at home in the middle of this COVID crisis and stew and get, bitter and nasty. And the only one that's going to suffer is you and the people that love you. I'm not like that. I like to get involved. I like to do things and, do what I can to help out my fellow man. So.
Okay, so I'm sitting here and every time you start talking, I always think of 20 other things that I want to talk about. But I when you see something, okay, because this intrigues me, because I don't know if the viewers or people can understand why I just love having conversation with you, because we start here, but we're always everywhere else, because it takes you in these conversations that have sparked something else. So you say get involved, do all those things. How do you know that when you're because I already know this answer for me, when you see something that catches your attention on social media, right? And because I've had this experience where I may react to somebody's message in their community, they say something that has nothing to do, that's their vision, that's their view, and you go on there and you want to say something and you want to put them straight because you don't believe in it and all that other, so for me, I've already had my experience where people have actually come and trolled me and tried to come into my community and tell me what I'm saying is wrong. So in a way, I kind of feel like that was my way to say, well, I'm really not going to, even talk about things that are going to piss people off. So I'm going to try to be the light and love. I can't do that all the time. But would you say that when you see something that makes you burn inside, like makes you angry, that's a cue for you to do that work? Like, I'm just trying to, you see that? Like, did you unmute yourself? Okay, go. Because I'm thinking, like, how do we tell people? Because there are those people out there that don't know what to do next. Like you were saying, just go do it, go volunteer. How do you know that that's what you want to do? And to me, that's usually it. If it's something that makes me angry, I need to do work on that. Would you agree?
Well, my record of volunteerism is not quite as focused as yours. I just, whatever I feel like volunteering for is basically what I volunteer for. So I volunteered for the Children's Aid Society. I volunteered for the public library, which was a pretty cool experience. I volunteered for Good Fellows. I've been a volunteer tutor. And in fact, anybody who ever needs tutoring, particularly only mathematics, just give me a call and I'll be there for you in a heartbeat. So I've never been one to focus on any particular volunteer work. The point I'm trying to make is, if you want to act like the way you're acting, or react the way you're reacting to the world, and focus on a particular issue, in this case it's Indigenous issues, then do it, go nuts. But you don't have to. The whole point is for you to stay healthy and mentally healthy, you as an individual. And I noticed that there's a lot of people, not just in my life, but extended friends and family, who are suffering, especially today. And that's the one way to really take the suffering away. And not only does it take your own personal suffering away, it's exposing the beast that we talked about. Think about the analogy of the one-celled organism dominating the world. It really does expose it, because what you're you're doing is you're actually creating energy and momentum without getting money. That's huge. That's huge, and that exposes the monster in itself. Going back to what I was talking about when it comes to the marginalized, the people who are oppressed, poor, are homeless veterans, or veterans themselves, which are marginalized, are older people, which are dropping like flies at alarming rates due to this COVID thing. These are all marginalized people. They've been forgotten, or at least put off to the side because of the way the society, the way that the monster operates. Because it doesn't serve the monster to keep people of low, people who are outside of the margin. It doesn't serve the monster for them to be healthy and protected, and you know what I'm talking about. So when you do things like volunteer, it does expose the monster. So it exposes some of the bad things that are happening in the world, and you become more fulfilled, and you start being the change that you want in this world. I think, anyways.
Thanks. And I appreciate always everything that you share and say, because I think that, I mean, that just like this platform, Speak Up and Empower, right? It's just giving people that opportunity to speak their truth, do the best that they can, enlighten and lift everybody up, because that's what we do. That's what our purpose is supposed to be, is to serve everyone. So I'm not sure what else we can talk about. Is there something that you wanted to share? One more point of light that you want to share before we go?
Yeah, well, there's a couple actually. Like we've been talking for nearly a half hour here. We haven't talked specifically about Indigenous issues, and that's basically what we're here for. I wanted to set the stage, but of course I droned on and on and on about why, and have some empathy, not forgiveness, not sympathy, but empathy. And that's a huge distinction. That's something that Indigenous peoples, not just here in Canada, but worldwide, have an incredible astuteness for, is empathy. So I'm not, and again, I'm not saying forgive. What I'm saying is have empathy for how everybody's been duped over these last 150 years by this one-celled organism dominating the world. We take a look at some of the Indigenous issues. We take a look at the racism. We take a look at there's a couple of examples of how racism, or how Indigenous issues have dominated Canadian public, and it goes all the way back to our treaties, all the original treaties. Now, I'm not terribly well versed on all the Indigenous treaties. I'm really not, but I've read, kind of given cursory glances over the years, and I've read a few last night as I was preparing for your interview here. And the one common thread amongst most of the treaties is that the language in them is not terribly codifying. In other words, it's very ambiguous, and there's a lot left open for interpretation. And if you take a look at the nuance and the context behind it, especially the reactions of the chiefs and the Aboriginal people who have negotiated those treaties, not just here in Canada, but worldwide, there's a lot of trust on the Aboriginal people when those treaties were negotiated. And it's as clear as day, to me anyways, and I certainly hope to the average person, that language the treaties are not being lived up to. They're just not. And we'll say the white man, but I don't like saying the white man. I like saying like the establishment. It doesn't serve the establishment to live up to the language, the true spirit of treaties. It really doesn't. So they look for ways to navigate around the treaties that we've negotiated, both the government, the crown, and the crown and the Indigenous peoples. They look for holes in it, and then so in other words, that these documents aren't terribly sophisticated as they should be, but the apparatus that controls the government and the crown is terribly sophisticated. It always has been, and it always will be. So we're in for a fight. Now let me give you a couple of solid examples of how it's really been toxic here in Canada, here in Ontario, not far from our ancestors' home reservation. The Six Nations Reserve just outside of Grant County in Caledonia. Caledonia has been a source of contention here in Ontario for at least 20 years. They want to constantly expand, and and you can say this about the Site C out in BC. You can say this the same exact thing about Muskrat Falls in the Ottawa Valley. You can say the same thing about the Nova Scotia fishermen problems out in with the lobster fisheries right now. Is that the Indigenous people in this country? Before I say something about that, I'll tell you what. Canada's a great country. I love Canada. But I'll tell you one thing: what separates Canada and all of the first world from, let's say, the third world, quote unquote, third world, what separates us is something called due process. And people of margin, in particular, people of Indigenous all over the world, but here in Canada, are not given due process. They react. The people who conflict with the Indigenous people, like the people of Caledonia, who have a right to a home, are not giving, through our court system, through our political system, and the Indigenous people of the Six Nations Reserve are not given the due process that the people on the other side of the table are. The people out in Nova Scotia are not given. The people out in Alberta, when it comes to land, they're just not given the due process. Everything's being dismissed. And then you see things like going to the Supreme Court of Canada, and sometimes the Indigenous people winning, but still, if you got to read deep into it, I don't want to get too deep into these issues because we can go on for about 3 or 4 hours, but look into it. They're just not given the due process. The Site C is probably one of the biggest glaring examples, Site C Dam Project, and that was rushed through by a so-called left party. The NDP has been controlling British Columbia for the last few years, and they just won a major election the other night. They now have the majority. And this is the NDP, but I grew up with the NDP as being one of the most left pro-worker, and they're pro-Indigenous too. And what they did out in BC was really scandalous. And now they're building on treaty protected lands out in BC, and it's the same in Caledonia as well. It's like there's no regard for what's happening. These treaties don't mean that much. Now, that being said, we have a prime minister who's got a pretty face. Let's face facts. He speaks well, and what a contrast from that lunatic in the United States. So he's really enamored the Canadian public, right? But the thing is, read between the lines. And a lot of people, especially part of my extended family, aren't going to like what I'm about to say, but he's no better. He's no better than the average politician when it comes to, because he's got to feed that monster. That monster I keep talking about. He doesn't have the political will. The Liberal Party doesn't have the political will. Definitely the Conservative Party doesn't have the political will, because they're threatening by serving and honoring the treaties. They're threatening, being ousted from their office. So it's just something that these are discussions that we need to have as Indigenous people, and how we're going to affect that kind of change, not only within the Indigenous community, but within the Canadian community. And this is why I think Grandmother's Voice represents such incredible. This is such an incredible power for opportunity for benevolence, and just letting people know what's happening out there within Indigenous communities. And then hopefully, over the years, like I said this months ago, when the COVID crisis first started, what I wanted out of the COVID crisis, somebody asked me, what do you think is going to happen over the coming months? And I said, well, I think what's going to happen is we're going to have, actually, what was happening at the time, so it was asked like maybe a month or so into the lockdowns. I said, I think what's happening now is we're going through a societal catharsis in the world today, and people are starting to wake up to this monster that we've been talking about through our whole discussion, and how rotten and toxic this neoliberal capitalistic society is, and how dangerous it is for the environment, how dangerous it is for humanity. It's an existential threat, and that's just a demonstrable empirical fact. That's not my opinion. This is something that's been published by hundreds of scientists, thousands of scientists over the last 50, 60 years. It was even, this is something that people don't know. This was something that Exxon, one of the biggest oil companies in the world, back before I was born, actually released a memo, and some progressive sites got a hold of it about 10 years ago, released a memo saying that almost those exact words, that climate change caused by fossil fuels is an existential threat to humankind. This is Exxon. So this is something that it doesn't feed that monster, that narrative, and we have to take a look at that, and we have to open up those discussions. And the reason why I brought up the pandemic was because the pandemic has exposed horribly how fragile, how brittle the current economic system is, and how it's got no elasticity, which means that there's any stress on it, it collapses, or at least it bends to the point of near breaking almost every few years with a recession. And now we're here in an economic crisis. Don't tell me we don't have the resources to go through this. It's a crock. It's an absolute pile of BS. So, and I think people are starting to wake up. I was a little discouraged back in the summertime, but I think people, you take a look at Black Lives Matter. I keep mentioning Black Lives Matter. It's more than just a movement right now. It's very similar to what's going on here in Canada with Grandmother's Voice. I think it's a centralized or decentralized structure of people that is actually considered. I think it's going to be considered an NGO at one time, a non-governmental organization that's actually taking off and spreading throughout the world. And and I think I see that potential with Grandmother's Voice as well. So I don't know. What do you think of that?
I think you're a champ. I think you're a champ, and you need to get a brand new damn computer, because whatever's going, your microphone or something is muffled. But I'm like, so if I could lean in more or whatever without people seeing my face, I would. I love it. Like I could listen to you next time, which is we're gonna have Yana next time, and we're gonna have a clear connection, because the conversations, everything that you brought up has been it just excites me. I'm gonna mention two things, and then I'm gonna read two of these messages that we got from some of my friends that are messaging. And thank you guys for watching, because this is so really important for me. And what we're doing for Grandmother's Voice. But today we had a meeting, myself, the grandmothers, my niece, and Sherry, another co-founder. So the co-founders, all the co-founders of Grandmother's Voice, met with the police, the Halton Regional Police. And we're in a community that is pretty much, we'll say, unceded territory. There's no friendship center, there's no nothing. It's just been, I've been here for 30 years living on in this area, in this community, Iroquois Shore. Like it just, to me, was, I was called here, and I know this, especially from the work that I do now with the elders and the grandmothers. Has just been amazing, and I'm living my purpose and able to, because I'm guided every day, and it's so amazing. But we sat with a few people from the Halton Regional Police and the grandmothers, and we brought up the pandemic, and Grandmother Renee said, we needed this. People were asking. We talked about mental health in this talk. We talked about, like, people were saying, I just need a break. I need to breathe. I need to go home. I just need to be. I need to figure out this. I need to figure out this crazy world that we're living in. I need to figure out all of these systems I belong in that are strangling me as a human being. I just want to live, and I want to live. And you just touched on so much, the due process, and like all of this stuff is so important. And I never thought that I would actually consider or think of any of these things when I read a newspaper or watch or pay attention. And my partner, my boss at the school board, Sherry Sayville, she's a champ. She is just a plethora of knowledge, like you are, Gord. Like, she reads everything, and she's on it, and she knows information, and she knows the information to share, and she knows the right way to share it with people. And so I'm so grateful that I have someone like her and you that can guide me, because I don't have time to really get into the detail. I just kind of live and be, and I like to think represent. But Grandmother Renee said that we need this little space to stop, and this is the change, and this is where the beginning of the pandemic, the messaging that I received, and as Grandmother's Voice, we said, this is the time where at the end, like, we're going to be, it's like a new canvas. We're just going to show up, and we're going to say, this is how we're going to do, this is how we're going to be, this is reciprocity that we need. This is what we want to do as for Indigenous people, to create that sovereignty, protect the legacies, to do all of that work, and then show up at a community table and say to them, we're here to support you no matter what. We need to now go back to that treaty of the two-row wampum, and what it means to get it to be in relationship and share each other's knowledge. So that was our experience today, and it was really amazing that we had an opportunity to share that space and agree that we need both policy and procedures and traditional knowledge to pick up where we are right now and do it in that way that is really honorable to both sides. I wanted to read Hillary Lake. I love the crap out of you wherever you are. You're in Michigan somewhere. I watch you travel. She's like one of the most beautiful human beings I've ever met in my life. She wrote, I love your perspective on this, Jody. Yes, I feel that if it makes us angry, there's definitely something to work on there. We also can do that in the moment by breathing into our experience and caring for ourselves so that we can build a relationship to others in these places. And Gordo, you touched on that too, right? How important it is to just acknowledge, the even just like all of that experience. And that's a whole other 4-hour talk. And Karen Scadden, love you, like friend from birth for me. Thank you, Jody and Gord. Great discussion. The more we know, and the better we need to do. Empathy goes a long way. Just thinking of your own family in these situations would surely change your perspective. Keep the conversations going. We're listening and learning. And then cousin Scott, what don't you guys have anything to do on a Wednesday afternoon at lunchtime? I don't know. Anyway, I love you, Scott. You and Stace, man, our life. Not sure who this guy is, but he looks like my grandfather and talks like my Uncle Bob. And it's for real. That's totally real. Anyway, Brother Gordo, I love you. It has been so awesome. Next conversation, this is when we got to get Cheryl into this and talk about what we were talking about creating, a couple months ago, where we're like, my best friends that can get together and have these conversations and love each other even more after them, and just sharing our knowledge and our perspectives. And so thank you, Nyawangoa, for everybody for tuning in and being here. Grandmother's Voice is doing some really amazing things, and we're just being guided to do this work and to show up and make those spaces safe for people to have these conversations. Thank you, Speak Up and Empower, for being here. Gordo, you want to say anything? You want to say hi to Mom?
Hey, Ma, love you. But just one quick thing before I let you go, Joe. For the people who are listening and who listen to what you have to say and listen to what I have to say, and they want to do a general inquiry in what's happening, not just with the Indigenous people, Black Lives Matter, or any other marginalized group. You got to question the media, your media consumption, like Fox News or MSNBC or CNN. Just question it, and always be skeptical. And that reminds me of my favorite quote of all times by Martin Luther King, and that goes as, unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the ultimate say in reality. So just remember that. Know where your information is coming from and vet it and really understand where it's coming from. Thank you. Love you too.
I love you. See you guys.